The wind, a mournful whisper through the skeletal branches of the autumn maples, was the most faithful mourner at Eleanor's grave. Arthur Jenkins stood a little straighter than his 87 years usually allowed, the worn tweed jacket hanging loose on his thin frame. His hands, gnarled from decades of toil on the land and before that, mending men, were clasped before him, still. He watched the last clod of earth fall, a dull thud that echoed the finality in his own heart. Eleanor, his Ellie. 63 years they'd spun their lives together, a tapestry frayed now, one thread pulled loose, the whole pattern undone. The small cemetery on the outskirts of Oakhaven held few witnesses to her departure. Pastor Miles, new to the town and newer still to Arthur and Eleanor, offered sincere but generic condolences. His words smooth pebbles dropped into the vast ocean of Arthur's grief. Mrs. Gable from the post office, who had always had a kind word for Eleanor. Young Thomas Henderson, who sometimes helped Arthur with the heavier chores on the farm, stood awkwardly by the gate, cap in hand. And two ladies from the church auxiliary, their faces etched with polite sympathy, a duty performed. That was all. They had moved to Oakhaven 5 years prior, chasing a gentler climate for Eleanor's struggling lungs. The small farm they bought was more a place to anchor their remaining years than a serious enterprise. They were quiet folk, their lives lived inward, their circle small, shrinking now to a single point of aching solitude. Arthur had hoped, in some unvoiced part of his heart, that the town might have noticed Eleanor more, noticed them. But Oakhaven was a place of long-settled roots, and newcomers, especially elderly ones, often remained on the periphery, like leaves blown against a garden wall, present but not truly part of the soil. After the brief service, the meager attendees drifted away, their low murmurs fading into the rustle of dry leaves. Arthur remained, the chill seeping into his bones, a cold that had little to do with the late October air. He was a silhouette against the gray sky, a man carved from sorrow, ignored not with malice, but with the casual blindness of the preoccupied. He felt it keenly, this invisibility. It was as if he too had been laid to rest, his presence a mere shadow beside the fresh mound of earth. He thought of another time, another cold, another kind of desolation. The snow had been relentless that winter in Korea, a bitter, biting blanket over the frozen hills. He'd been young then, barely a man, his hands stained not with earth, but with blood. The blood of boys who cried for their mothers, their eyes wide with the shock of what war did to flesh and bone. He was a medic, assigned to Charlie Company. One particular night, under a relentless barrage, the aid station, a flimsy tent offering more prayer than protection, had been hit. Chaos erupted. Men screamed. Arthur, dazed but driven by a force he never named, had crawled through the freezing mud and snow, dragging the wounded one by one to the dubious safety of a shallow ravine. He remembered the metallic taste of fear, the stench of cordite and burnt flesh, but mostly, he remembered the faces, pale, trusting, desperate. He'd worked for hours, his fingers numb, his supplies dwindling, whispering words of reassurance. He wasn't sure he believed himself. He'd set bones with splints made from shattered rifles, stitched gaping wounds with shaking hands, and breathed warmth into blue lips. He hadn't thought of heroism. He'd only thought of the next man, the next breath, the next desperate prayer that his efforts would be enough. He'd been so focused on them, he hadn't even realized when a piece of shrapnel had torn through his own thigh until a young private, his arm in a makeshift sling Arthur had fashioned, pointed it out. He never spoke of those days. Not to Eleanor, not in detail. It was a darkness locked away. She knew he had served, had seen hardship. She respected his silence. He wore no medals, sought no accolades. It was simply what he had done, what had been asked of him. The quiet humility he carried then had become the bedrock of his character, the unassuming strength that had seen him through a long life of hard work and simple joys. He was unaware, utterly, that those frantic, selfless hours in a forgotten war, tending to the broken bodies of young men, had sown seeds that would, decades later, blossom in the most unexpected of ways. Back at the farmhouse, the silence was a physical weight. Eleanor's scent lingered faintly in her armchair, a cruel ghost. The knitting needles lay idle beside a half-finished scarf of soft blue wool. Arthur moved through the rooms like a visitor, touching things, a chipped teacup, her reading glasses, a faded photograph of them on their wedding day, young and bright with a future that had now become a past. Days turned into a week. The initial few casseroles left on his porch by the church ladies stopped appearing. The phone, once carrying Eleanor's cheerful chatter with her sister long distance, remained mute. Thomas Henderson came by to fix a loose fence post, his youthful unease a stark contrast to Arthur's settled grief. He was kind, but Arthur knew the boy had his own life, his own concerns. The town of Oakhaven continued its rhythm, oblivious to the quiet crumbling of a man's world within its limits. Arthur felt the isolation not as a judgment, but as a simple, cold fact. He was old, bereaved, and, it seemed, forgotten. One evening, sifting through a box of Eleanor's keepsakes, old letters, pressed flowers, a child's tiny silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, he found a small velvet-lined box. Inside, nestled against faded satin, were his own service medals. He rarely looked at them. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart. They felt like relics from another man's life. Tucked beneath them was a commendation, a formal piece of paper, its typewritten words precise, almost sterile, yet speaking of courage under fire, of disregard for his own safety in rendering aid to his fallen comrades. It mentioned the specific engagement, the number of men he was credited with saving. He read it, a flicker of some distant emotion stirring within him, not pride, more a weariness, a remembering. He thought of those young faces again. Were any of them still alive? Did they remember the medic with the steady hands and quiet voice who had pulled them from the brink? He didn't expect them to. Life moved on. Memories faded. Almost on impulse, more as a way to fill the hollow hours than with any real expectation, he found a piece of paper and an old fountain pen, Eleanor's favorite. He decided to write to the Regimental Association, if such a thing still existed. His old unit, the 27th Infantry Regiment. He wouldn't ask for anything. He simply wanted to inform them, as a point of record perhaps, that Eleanor Jenkins, wife of former Private First Class Arthur Jenkins, service number such and such, medic, Charlie Company, had passed away. She had been, in her own way, a soldier's wife, living with the echoes of his service for all their married life. It felt like a small, final duty to her memory, a connection to a past that, however distant, was a part of who he was, and therefore, who she had loved. He sealed the envelope, addressed it with the last known address he could find for the association in an old reunion newsletter, and placed a stamp upon it. He nearly didn't mail it. It seemed a futile gesture, a whisper into a storm. But the next morning, on his way to buy feed, he dropped it into the blue mailbox outside the Oakhaven post office. A small act, quickly forgotten, sent out into the vast, indifferent world. Life settled into a muted routine, the turning of the leaves from gold to rust, the crisping of the air, the long, quiet evenings. Arthur tended his small plot of land, the rhythmic work a familiar comfort. He missed Eleanor's presence beside him in the garden, her quiet humming as she weeded, her joy at the first sight of spring bulbs. Now, the earth felt heavier, the rows longer. He was, he thought, simply waiting for his own season to end. He expected nothing more from Oakhaven, nor from the world beyond it. A few weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that was no different from any other, Arthur was mending a harness in the old barn, the scent of aged wood and hay, a familiar balm. The air was still, the silence broken only by the cooing of pigeons in the rafters and the rhythmic rasp of his needle through thick leather. Then, a sound. Faint at first, a low, distant rumble, like far-off thunder. He paused, listening. It grew, steadily, becoming a rhythmic, percussive beat. Not thunder, something else. Something organized. He put down the harness, his brow furrowed. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't experienced much of late, pulled him towards the barn door. He stepped out into the pale sunlight, looking down the long, unpaved track that led from his farm to the county road, and beyond that, to the main street of Oakhaven. The sound was clearer now, a distinct, powerful cadence, thump, thump, thump. And with it, another sound, brassy and resonant, the stirring call of a bugle, then the steady beat of drums. Arthur's heart, old and tired, gave an unfamiliar lurch. He'd heard that sound before, though many, many decades had passed. It was the sound of marching men. He walked slowly towards the end of his track, his gaze fixed on the point where it met the paved road. What could it be? A parade? Oakhaven wasn't much for parades, not outside of the 4th of July. Then he saw them. Turning off the main street, onto the county road that led past his farm, came a column of soldiers. Not a handful, not a platoon. Rank upon rank of them, their uniforms crisp, their bearing precise, their polished boots striking the asphalt in perfect unison. They moved with a discipline that was timeless, a river of olive drab and gleaming brass under the autumn sun. At their head, a color guard, the stars and stripes in a regimental banner held high, snapping crisply in the light breeze. Arthur stopped, dumbfounded. His mind struggled to reconcile the sight before him with the quiet ordinariness of his Oakhaven existence. Soldiers, hundreds of them, marching towards his farm. They reached the turn onto his track, the unpaved surface doing little to muffle the powerful rhythm of their advance. The ground seemed to vibrate with their passage. They filled the lane, a solemn, purposeful procession. At their head marched an officer, his gaze straight ahead, his expression stern but respectful. Arthur could only stare, his hand unconsciously rising to his chest. What was happening? Was he dreaming? Had his grief finally unsettled his mind? The column halted, perfectly, silently, just before the gate to his farmyard. The sudden cessation of the marching sound was as impactful as its presence had been. Only the faint jingle of equipment and the rustle of the wind in the trees remained. The lead officer, a man with silver at his temples and the chevrons of a colonel on his shoulders, took 3 precise steps forward. He stopped directly in front of Arthur, who stood rooted to the spot, his worn work clothes a stark contrast to the immaculate uniforms before him. The colonel raised his hand in a slow, sharp salute. "Private First Class Arthur Jenkins?" he asked, his voice clear and respectful, carrying easily in the sudden quiet. Arthur, his throat dry, managed a nod. "Yes," he rasped, his own voice sounding foreign and weak. "Colonel Davies, commanding officer, Honest Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment, United States Army," the officer announced. "We're here, Mr. Jenkins, on behalf of a grateful nation and a regiment that never forgets its own." Arthur's mind reeled. The 27th Infantry Regiment, his regiment. But how? Why? Behind the colonel, the battalion stood at ease, yet alert, their faces young, serious, looking at this old farmer with a kind of reverence that Arthur couldn't comprehend. Word had spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. A full battalion of soldiers marching down Main Street, then turning off towards the old Jenkins farm. Mrs. Gable had seen them from the post office window, her jaw dropping. Young Thomas Henderson, riding his bicycle to his afternoon job, had skidded to a halt, eyes wide. Even Pastor Miles, preparing his Sunday sermon, heard the drums and stepped outside the church, bewildered. Slowly, hesitantly, a small crowd of Oakhaven residents began to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the unbelievable spectacle. They lined the county road, their faces a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and dawning amazement. They saw the soldiers, the flags, the solemnity, and they saw old Arthur Jenkins, the quiet, grieving widower most of them barely knew, standing before them all. Colonel Davies gestured to a younger officer, a captain, who stepped forward, holding a small, polished wooden box and a scroll. "Mr. Jenkins," Colonel Davies continued, his voice resonating with a sincerity that touched Arthur to his core. "Your letter to the Regimental Association regarding the passing of your wife, Eleanor, was received. In processing it and in reviewing historical records, certain details of your service came to light. Details that, perhaps, were not given their full due at the time." He paused, letting his words settle. "The Korean War was a brutal conflict, Mr. Jenkins. Many acts of valor went unrecognized in the fog of war, or were acknowledged only modestly. Your records, sir, speak of uncommon courage." The captain opened the scroll. His voice, younger but equally respectful, began to read. It was a citation, far more detailed and eloquent than the typewritten commendation Arthur had kept hidden for so long. It spoke of the night the aid station was overrun, of Medic Jenkins repeatedly exposing himself to heavy enemy fire to retrieve wounded soldiers, of establishing a makeshift triage under relentless shelling, of working tirelessly for over 12 hours, saving the lives of an estimated 32 men despite his own injuries. It spoke of his calm demeanor, his skill, his unwavering dedication when all around was chaos and death. "For extraordinary heroism," the captain read, "and selfless devotion to his comrades, Private First Class Arthur Jenkins not only upheld the highest traditions of the Medical Corps and the United States Army, but also demonstrated a degree of courage and compassion that served as an inspiration to all who witnessed his actions." As the captain read, Flashes of memory, sharp and visceral, returned to Arthur. The acrid smell of smoke, the freezing touch of snow on bloodied skin, the desperate pleas, the feel of a young soldier's weakening pulse beneath his fingertips. He hadn't thought of it as heroism. He'd thought of it as necessity, as doing what needed to be done because there was no one else. The captain finished reading and stepped back. Colonel Davies then opened the wooden box. Inside, on a bed of blue velvet, lay a medal Arthur had never seen before. It gleamed in the sunlight. "Mr. Jenkins," the colonel said, his voice softer now. "Decades overdue, but no less heartfelt for the delay. The United States Army wishes to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross for your gallantry in action on that night." Arthur stared at the medal, then at the faces of the soldiers before him, then at the small crowd of Oakhaven residents watching from the roadside. He saw Mrs. Gable dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. He saw Thomas Henderson, his mouth agape. He saw Pastor Miles, his expression one of profound humility. Tears welled in Arthur's eyes, the first he'd shed since those raw, initial days after Eleanor's passing. These were different tears, not of grief, but of an overwhelming tide of emotions. Gratitude, astonishment, a deep, unexpected sense of connection. The colonel carefully pinned the medal to Arthur's worn tweed jacket. Then, he stepped back and rendered another sharp salute. As one, the entire battalion followed, a wave of salutes rippling down the ranks, a silent, powerful tribute to the old medic standing before them. The silence that followed was profound. It was broken by a single, tentative sound of clapping from the roadside. Then another, and another, until a wave of applause, hesitant at first, then growing in warmth and conviction, rolled across the field from the people of Oakhaven. They were applauding not just a hero they hadn't known they had, but perhaps also acknowledging their own oversight, their own failure to see the quiet dignity and extraordinary past of the man who lived among them. Arthur, his hand instinctively covering the medal, could only bow his head, overwhelmed. He felt Eleanor's presence then, keenly, as if she were standing beside him, her hand in his, her gentle pride enveloping him. This honor, he knew, was as much for her steadfast love and support through all the quiet years, as it was for him. The formality of the presentation soon gave way to something more personal. Colonel Davies dismissed the battalion for a short period, and soldiers, young men mostly, approached Arthur, not in formation, but as individuals. They shook his hand, their grips firm, their eyes respectful. Some were shy, merely murmuring their thanks. Others, bolder, asked him about his service, about Charlie Company, about the Korea they had only read about in history books. "My grandfather served in the 12th Infantry Division, sir," one young sergeant said, his voice earnest. "He always said the medics were the bravest of them all." Another, a specialist with kind eyes, simply said, "Thank you for your service, Mr. Jenkins. It's an honor to meet you." Arthur, his voice still thick with emotion, spoke softly with them, answering their questions as best he could. He found himself sharing small details, memories he thought long buried. The bitter cold, the camaraderie, the faces of the men he had tried to save. He didn't speak of glory, but of duty, of shared hardship, of the simple human need to help another in dire straits. He was modest, humble, even in this moment of unexpected recognition. He deflected praise, turning it instead to the bravery of all soldiers, the sacrifices made by so many. The townsfolk, too, began to approach, their earlier awkwardness replaced by a genuine warmth. Mayor Thompson, a portly man who usually only saw Arthur at town meetings about property taxes, came forward, his hand outstretched. "Mr. Jenkins." "Arthur," he said, his voice a little shaky. "On behalf of Oakhaven, we're honored, and frankly, ashamed we didn't know. You and Mrs. Jenkins, such quiet, good people." Mrs. Gable, her eyes still red-rimmed, pressed a small paper bag into his hand. "Some apple muffins, dear," she said softly. "Eleanor always liked my apple muffins." Tears pricked Arthur's eyes again. "Thank you, Mary," he said, using her first name, perhaps for the first time. "She did. She truly did." Pastor Miles approached, his face etched with a deep sincerity. "Arthur," he began, "I officiated your wife's service with professional sympathy. I realize now I did so without true understanding of the life that stood beside hers, or indeed, the depth of the life she herself supported. Forgive an oversight born of ignorance, not malice. Your legacy, your quiet strength, it's a sermon in itself. Even young Thomas Henderson found his voice. Mr. Jenkins, that story. Wow. I mean, that was amazing, sir. Arthur managed a small, tired smile. It was a long time ago, Thomas. Just did what had to be done. The recognition was not loud or ostentatious, not a parade in his name. It was quieter, more personal. It was in the respectful nods from the soldiers, the warmth in the eyes of his neighbors, the sudden, heartfelt offers of help with the farm. Anything you need, Arthur, you just call? Mayor Thompson insisted. Anything at all. It was a balm to his lonely soul, this unexpected outpouring. It didn't erase his grief for Eleanor, but it somehow lessened the crushing weight of his isolation. He was no longer invisible. He was seen. His life, his service, Eleanor's memory. They were acknowledged, honored. Before the battalion prepared to depart, Colonel Davies approached Arthur again. He held out a small, heavy object in his gloved hand. It was a challenge coin, emblazoned with the crest of the 27th Infantry Regiment. A small token, Mr. Jenkins, the colonel said. From the wolfhounds of today to a wolfhound of the past, we don't forget. Arthur took the coin, its cool metal, a solid presence in his palm. He looked at the fierce wolf's head, the motto, Nec aspera terrent, difficulties be damned. He remembered. Thank you, Colonel, Arthur said, his voice stronger now. Thank you all. You've given an old man a very great gift today. No, Mr. Jenkins, Colonel Davies replied, his gaze steady. You gave us one long ago. We're just returning the honor. With crisp commands, the battalion reformed. The drums rolled. The bugle sounded a final, poignant call. And then, with the same precision with which they had arrived, they began to march away, their boots kicking up a little dust from Arthur's farm track. He stood watching, the Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his jacket, the challenge coin warm in his hand, until the last soldier disappeared from view, the sound of their marching fading slowly back into the quiet hum of the countryside. The people of Oakhaven lingered for a while, talking in hushed, respectful tones. They looked at Arthur differently now, with a new understanding, a new respect. The indifference had vanished, replaced by a burgeoning sense of community, a shared pride in this quiet man they had, for too long, overlooked. In the days and weeks that followed, Oakhaven was subtly changed, and so was Arthur's life within it. The quiet recognition continued, not in grand gestures, but in small, meaningful ways. Neighbors stopped by more often, not with pity, but with genuine offers of companionship or help. Mrs. Gable brought him meals regularly, just so you don't have to fuss. Thomas Henderson started coming by twice a week, unasked, to help with chores that were becoming too strenuous for Arthur alone, refusing any payment beyond a glass of lemonade and Arthur's stories. Pastor Miles made it a point to visit, not as a cleric to a parishioner, but as a friend. Arthur found himself talking more, sharing memories of Eleanor, of his life before Oakhaven, even a little about his time in the service. The loneliness didn't disappear entirely. Grief for a life partner of 6 decades leaves an indelible mark, but its sharpest edges were softened by the warmth of human connection. He was no longer a ghost in his own town. One crisp morning in early spring, months after the battalion's visit, Arthur stood in his field, the earth dark and damp, smelling of renewal. The sky was a vast, pale blue, washed clean by an overnight rain. He held a small handful of seeds, Eleanor's favorite sunflowers. He'd found the packet tucked away in her gardening apron. He knelt, his old knees protesting but obedient, and with his gnarled fingers, he pressed a seed into the welcoming soil. He thought of the young faces of the soldiers, so full of life and duty. He thought of the men he had tended so long ago, their lives hanging by a thread. He thought of Eleanor, her laughter like sunshine. The world had, for a time, forgotten, or perhaps it had simply not known. But now, it remembered. Not with public glory, but with a quiet, profound respect that resonated deeper than any fanfare. The citation for his medal and a framed photograph of the battalion on his farm track now rested on the mantelpiece, beside Eleanor's picture. Sometimes, he would take out the challenge coin, feeling its weight, its history. He planted another seed, and then another. He wasn't just planting sunflowers, he was planting hope, a continuation. The land would heal from the winter's harshness, just as his heart, slowly, was finding its way through the landscape of loss, guided by unexpected lights. The silence of his farm was still there, but it was different now. No longer the silence of isolation, but the quiet peace of a life acknowledged, a service remembered, a love that endured. Under the open sky, with the promise of new growth stirring in the earth beneath his hands, Arthur Jenkins felt a quiet sense of renewal, a soft echo of kindness returned, blooming in the unexpected spring of his solitary life.